Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Class 25, the last class for the second week of virtual remote teaching and learning. Today we're going to be talking about some of the efforts that have been taken at the international level to create a global climate governing regime. So today we are going to be describing the evolution of the international climate governance, talking about how the UNFCC developed and evolved over time. We're also going to be evaluating the strengths and limitations of existing agreements and institutions, including Kyoto and the Paris Climate Agreement. So some theoretical background before we get into the actual question. Much of the way that we talk about global climate government relies on ideas, thinking about both public goods and common pool resources. So public goods, things that are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. These are goods that you cannot prevent anyone from accessing. They're non-excludable, but they also aren't taken up. They aren't used up when someone consumes the good. So me enjoying the public good does not make it any less enjoyable for someone else. And the danger here is free riding. Everyone benefits from having the public goods provided, but no one wants to pay the cost to provide them. And so we can think of the environment or a clean environment as a whole as a public good. Everyone reaps the benefit of a healthy environment, even if they don't contribute to maintaining it. And this means that there's a huge incentive to free ride and not actually work to ensure a healthy and clean environment. And so the solution to public goods is that they have to be publicly provided. You need some sort of political institution or body with enough power, authority, and resources to provide the public good. That's why we have governments to provide things like the national defense, public schools, etc. But we can also think of common pool resources. And these are non-excludable, they are common, everyone has access to them, but they're also rivalrous. That is, when one person enjoys part of one of the good, it uses up or it depletes it for another person. And the danger here is that of overconsumption, that it creates an incentive for people to consume more than their fair share so they can get some of the common pool resource before it gets consumed. And so we can think of the environment as a common pool of resources. Natural resources, whether clean air or water, or more concretely, things like timber, aquaculture, fisheries, arable farmland, etc. These are finite, and that creates an incentive to overconsume. And so the solutions have been debated in the economics and political science literature, that we need either coercive regulations in order to force people to not overconsume, that's Garrett Hardin's argument, or Elinor Ostrom's argument that we need to create local institutions to allow communities to self-govern these common pool resources. So which is the global climate? On the one hand, we can think of it as a public good, and here we're talking about the stability of the climate system. That everyone benefits from having a stable climate system that's not, that is hospitable for human life in society. And the challenge here is how do we ensure that everyone contributes to maintaining a stable global climate system? Everyone would benefit, so how do we make sure that everyone pays their fair share? But we can also think of the climate change through the lens of a common pool resource. That is, that there's a finite carbon budget, that the atmosphere can only absorb so much carbon dioxide without causing runaway global warming. And so here the challenge is how do we ensure that individuals don't overuse this finite resource? Now, however we frame this question, both of these require building political institutions to coordinate behavior, whether these are coercive, whether these are more like microeconomic nudges, whether these are based on community solidarity. We need powerful institutions to solve this. But climate change means that we not just need any institutions, we need global institutions. On the one hand, carbon has a very long period of longevity, that 65 to 80% of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is absorbed between 20 and 200 years. So you need long-term institutions, you need global institutions, because greenhouse gas emissions affect the climate as a whole, no matter where the emissions came from. There's the problem of embodied carbon, right? That even if your personal burning of fossil fuels is low, you might have, through the goods that you consume, the food you eat, the technology that you have, all of those things required carbon to be burnt, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions to be emitted into the atmosphere through their production, distribution, and your consumption before they even get to your consumption of it. And finally, there's the concern, and we talked about this earlier, about carbon leakage. That is, without a global treaty, then you're going to risk highly emissions-intensive industries moving to those who opt out of a global treaty. So these are some of the challenges facing a global climate regime. So how have we done over the past 30 years? And the answer is not great. And I'm going to give a quick history, and your reading for today also gave a kind of overview of how this has evolved since the late 80s, early 90s. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, I've cited many times in this class, the Meteorological Organization, and the UN Environment Program in 1988. And the purpose of this body was to gather thousands of climate scientists and other experts to help inform and advise policymakers. Now, the IPCC does not conduct its own research, but it does survey, evaluate, and summarize the state of scientific and economic and sociological research on climate change. And it produces reports that include policy recommendations based on scientific findings. So it's both kind of summarizing and evaluating the state of the research and using that research to make policy recommendations. And it has published a total of 5 assessment reports. It's currently working on the 6th assessment report that will come out in the next few years. In 1990, they found that there was some evidence of anthropogenic climate change, but there was not a clear consensus. By 1995, there was a balance of evidence suggesting a discernible human influence on the climate. In 2001, in the 3rd assessment report, there was a stronger evidence of human-caused warming, but there are likely to be more negative than positive effects of higher levels of warmings. By 2007, they were asserting that warming was unequivocal, and there are possibilities of abrupt and irreversible environmental impacts of global warming. And then by the most recent report that was published over the course of 2013 and 2014, they concluded that it was extremely likely that humans were responsible for climate change, and that the current trend suggests warming of at least to 2 degrees Celsius with significant impacts on the planet. So what have the world powers done in response to this knowledge? In 1992, following the Rio Earth Summit, they formed, parties signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this was following the presentation of the first reports of the IPCC. And this created the legal framework for climate cooperation. Signatories agreed to continue researching climate change and policy responses, sharing this information with each other, and that they would have annual conference of party meetings where all the signatories of the UNFCCC, which is just about every country in the world, would meet yearly in order to negotiate further treaties, share research, and continue working to combat climate change. Now, this didn't include specific mandates or policies, but it outlined a broad goal of stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations that would, quote, prevent dangerous anthropogenic influence with the climate system. And so the goal was that the specific meetings and treaties would come out of the UNFCC to adopt with specific policies to meet this goal. Article 3 of this framework convention also suggests that the parties have introduces this idea of common but differentiated responsibility. And this is the idea that parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind, on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Accordingly, the developed countries, this is quoting from Article 3, the developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. So the UNFCCC is on board with the distributive principles, at least in theory, that the wealthy developed countries should have a stronger obligation than developing countries. So the UNFCCC divides the world into different commitment levels. So Annex 1 countries are all of the industrialized OECD nations, as well as economies in transitions. Annex 2 parties, and I'll have a map to show this a bit more clearly, are all of the Annex 1 parties except for the EITs. So this is going to exclude economies in transition like Russia, Brazil, etc. Non-Annex 1 countries are every other party to the UNFCCC, and there are special designation of least developed countries, these LDCs that you might hear people talk about, which are the 49 developing economies with limited capacity to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And the idea here is that commitment levels are going to increase. It's going to be higher for Annex 2 than for Annex 1, and Annex 1 for non-Annex 1, and the lowest requirements for the LDCs. So what does this look like? So you can see that the green here are the Annex 1 and 2 parties. So it's North America, Australia, Japan, Western Europe. Annex 1 parties include Russia, much of Eastern and Central Europe, and Turkey. And then non-Annex parties is the rest of the world. You'll see that there are a handful of observer states, UNFCCC, but they are observer states. So this is kind of dividing the world here into these kind of main parties, with the green having the highest level of commitment. If we get my laser pointer out here. So the green states are going to have the highest level of commitment. The blue states, the second highest level of commitment, and the lowest commitments for the yellow states here. So the Kyoto Protocol is where we actually get the first major attempt to establish a treaty to meet the goals of the UNFCCC. And this was at the third Conference of Parties in Kyoto, Japan in 1997. And so the goal here of this agreement was to establish emissions reductions targets for different countries. In 1990, greenhouse gas emissions were used as a baseline, in different countries based on the common but differentiated responsibility principle were given different emission targets to be achieved by 2012. The US itself pledged to emissions reductions of 8% below 1990 levels by 2012. EU countries similarly pledged an 8% reduction. The Russian Federation had goals of 0% change, or to have no growth in emissions between 1990 and 2012. And other countries, such as Australia, were actually allowed to increase their emissions from 1990 levels, but that increase was capped at 8%. And emissions targets were primarily focused on developed countries, or the Annex B of the Kyoto Protocol, while developing countries were not given emission targets to reflect their need to develop. And so if we look at Annex B parties, these are parties that had binding targets in the second period, so like that were going longer. That is going to be the green states here. Other Annex B parties that had only binding targets in the first period are these purple states, Russia and Greenland here, and Japan. The blue states were non-Annex B parties. These were non-binding parties. These did not have binding commitments. And then you'll notice that the United States here, which is an Annex 2, so they would be an Annex B state in the Kyoto Protocol, they are orange, which means that they are signatory to the protocol, but they never ratified it. And the Kyoto Protocol included many concessions to the United States, including flexibility mechanisms to allow countries to meet their emissions reductions targets, not just through outright cuts to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but through trading schemes or investment in emissions reductions efforts in other countries. But despite these concessions to the United States, many opposed the treaty. Here you can see the results here of the Kyoto Treaty. Here, I'll come back to that slide in just a second. That in the Senate, the Byrd-Hagel resolution passed overwhelmingly. It was a 95-0 vote, which rejected any imposition of the costs of responding to climate change that did not impose similar standards on developing countries. And so, though President Clinton signed the treaty, it was never submitted to the Senate for ratification because of this resolution. And after taking office in 2001, George W. Bush formally withdrew from the United States from the convention. And so, despite this, the protocol went into effect in 2004 when Russia ratified the agreement, meeting the 55 countries who emit 55% of the emissions threshold for it to go into effect. And while European countries met and in some cases exceeded their emissions reductions targets, I'll go back to this chart here. Many in the scientific community have found that Kyoto targets have limited at best reduction in the increase of carbon emissions and would be insufficient to prevent potentially dangerous amounts of global warming. And so you can see the Kyoto target versus their actual emissions here. And you will notice that the United States is not on this because we never ratified it. But in general, like you can see some states have had significantly done much better than their Kyoto targets. Other states, you can see Canada here. Their Kyoto target was a decrease in 5% change from 1990 levels, and they actually had a 20% increase. Australia had a Kyoto target of 8% increase, and they had a 51% increase here. Other states were, more along the lines of the correct meeting their targets. However, despite the overall failure, there is some evidence, and this is from a paper published in 2019 in the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, that has found that that while the Kyoto Treaty obviously did not solve all of our problems, that they estimated that those who ratified the treaty had a 7% less expected emissions levels than they would have if they had, in the case of the protocol, not provided strict obligations and targets to be achieved. And so they estimate that there actually was significant effects of the Kyoto Treaty for those who actually ratified the treaty. So after Kyoto, the goals for Kyoto Treaty expired were around 2012, and so negotiators met in Copenhagen for the 15th Conference of Parties in 2009 in anticipation of Kyoto needing to be updated, and many were hopeful that the election of Barack Obama in the United States meant that there would be a meaningful and significant action taken. The goal was to set emissions targets beyond 2012. However, negotiations broke down with conflict between European and North American nations and developing countries like China, India, and Brazil. The developing parties objected to binding emissions targets, contending that they were unfairly limiting their economic development, given that the West had taken advantage of fossil fuels for a long time, and the Western countries, especially the Obama administration, objected to any claims of historical responsibility. There is a link to some leaked audio from behind the scenes negotiations, and I will put that link on Moodle, that you can actually hear some of the world leaders trying to negotiate out these efforts. Eventually, they were able to settle on a non-binding statement, the Copenhagen Accord, which affirmed the importance of limiting climate change and included voluntary emissions targets, but did not have any actual enforcement mechanisms. So then, in 2015, the heads of state met for the 21st Conference of Party in Paris, again to try to hammer out a binding agreement. And the goal was to limit global climate warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And they were more successful here by turning to nationally determined contributions. Every nation was to determine their own emissions reductions targets. And while these were non-binding, and that might seem counterintuitive, they were necessary to get all 196 parties of the UNFCC to agree on action. The developed nations also affirmed a $100 billion per year fund to assist developing and least developed countries to meeting both their mitigation goals and adaptation needs. However, many are critical of the Paris Climate Accord. A study found that national emissions targets in 2016 the nationally determined contributions would result in a 3-degree temperature increase, not the well below 2 degrees. A 2017 study published in the journal Nature suggested that none of the countries were even going to meet their Paris commitments, which themselves would not lead us to a 2-degree world. The IPCC itself that says that the NDC trajectories would already exhaust between 95 and 130% of the carbon budget needed for a 1.5 degree world by 2030, which leaves 0 to 9 years to bring down global emissions in 2030 to net zero. The U.S. famously also withdrew, or is in the process of withdrawing from the Paris Accord. In the summer of 2017, President Trump announced that the U.S. would withdraw from the Accord. The formal notice of the withdrawal cannot be submitted until the agreement is in force for 3 years, and so so they've begun the possible effective withdrawal date in November of 2019, and that's a year period, and so it would not go into full effect until November of this calendar year. However, while many people, especially in the United States, who care about climate policy, have argued for, including many presidential candidates in the Democratic primary, have argued for returning to the Paris Climate Accord, your other reading from Jennifer Allan suggests that we should be more skeptical of the Paris Accord and think of it much more as what she calls dangerous incrementalism. And she identifies two arguments here. The first is that the Paris Accord actually was just a repackaging of existing institutions which haven't worked. They try to build incentives or enforcement capacity, and they lack the financial or technological support for effective adaptation for the most vulnerable states. That it's mostly just kind of taking what's already not working and putting a nice new bow on it. She's also worried that it creates a false sense of security, that the Paris Accord makes us think that we have this plan, we've pledged to keep warming to under 2 degrees, therefore we've kind of solved the problem, but even though the scholarly evidence suggests that it's not going to work. So why does the Paris Accord look like this then? And she argues that there's a couple of reasons. First, the UNFCC desperately needed a successful treaty, especially after the failure of Copenhagen. Kyoto is no longer in effect. The UNFCC needed, in order to maintain its legitimacy as a framework convention, there had to be an actual treaty, not just another year of promises or back to the drawing board. There needed to be a successful treaty, and therefore many developing states, especially the Association for Pacific Island States, were willing to settle with the more industrialized countries. And the U.S. ultimately had a ratification straitjacket because of the U.S.'s significant amount of both of carbon emissions, the U.S.'s scale in the global economy and influence over international affairs, that the U.S. was basically able to set the terms of agreement. And so any climate treaty would have to be one agreed to the U.S. because if the U.S. did not agree with the treaty, did not sign and ratify this treaty, it would not be an effective global climate treaty. Now, when the U.S. withdrew from the climate, it rebuked the foundation on which developing country support was based. So these developing countries tried to win the United States participation, and so they adopted a treaty that would not actually meet the goals of keeping climate change to reasonable levels. And then the United States said, we don't care, we're out anyway. So that's kind of the great tragedy of the Paris Climate Accords. So why this impasse? So on the one hand, we can think that there's an obvious story about self-interest. People do not want to pay the cost for providing these public goods or regulating these common pool resources. But there's also a way that we can think about how there's different conceptions of fairness here. Parks and Roberts in a 2007 book argue that different relationships of power and global inequality shape what people think is fair. And so both the United States and developing economies can say that these burdens are unfair, and they might even be acting in good faith. So for example, George W. Bush opposed the Kyoto Protocol because it exempted 80% of the world, including major population centers in China and India, and it would basically say that and he was arguing that it was unfair to impose burdens on the United States that would have economic costs while letting a majority of the world's population not have to pay these costs. In contrast, this is the Center for Science and Environment, a research group in India, in response to this statement, basically accused the Bush administration for demanding for acting unfairly, because the global carbon dioxide emissions from one U.S. citizen was 19 times that of one Indian in 1996. And so this would be asking India to stem its survival emissions so that industrialized countries can continue to have a luxury emissions, and they argue that this amounts to demanding a freeze on global inequity, where rich countries stay rich, poor countries stay poor, since carbon dioxide emissions are closely linked to GDP growth. So before we go to next class, I wanted to show you something that we are unfortunately not able to do in class, but we were going to do a simulation here. Let me make sure I am sharing the right field, sharing C roads climate, perfect. We were going to do this in in-class simulation where you would be broken out into teams assigned to these different negotiation parties, the United States, the EU, other developed nations, China, India, and other developing nations. And so rather than actually negotiating out what a new treaty would look like, for your discussion threads, I'm going to invite you to play with these. And so you want to try to find a way to a treaty mitigations commitments that would limit global warming to either 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. But you want to also make it that it would be accord to principles of justice. So you can see here, let's say you are going to say that the United States needs to peak their emissions by 2040 with a fifth annual reduction rate of 20%. And that means that, well, you've shaved 0.2 degrees Celsius off of global warming by the end of the century. So you can play with this. I'll post the link in Moodle with different emissions peak years. This is when the year in which greenhouse gas emissions stop increasing. This is when they actually start decreasing, the rate at which they decrease. And then you can have efforts to both prevent deforestation and promote afforestation, or planting trees. So that link will be on Moodle. And let me go back to the slides for close up here. On Monday, we're going to turn to the question of geoengineering. Does geoengineering represent a way out of some of these ethical and political dilemmas? And here's the actual assignment for the discussion post. Play with the World Climate Simulator. Can you get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees with emission reduction targets consistent with principles of justice? Share a screenshot of your successful or most successful attempt. Talk about how you achieved it and what some of the biggest limitations of that project were. So that is it for today. I hope this week went smoothly. Again, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, problems, or concerns. I will see some of you in discussion section, and I will see you all next week. Have a good weekend.